This is the Fat Loss Pro Podcast.
Fat Loss Pro Podcast.
Discover what's needed to burn, build, and shape the body you want. You'll walk away knowing what you need to do to create results now. Chris DeFay is the authority on fat loss and getting you in shape. Cutting edge, results-based info from the world's best that unveils the curtain to quicker, simpler, no-nonsense fat burning, muscle building, and quality health.
Welcome to the Fat Loss Pro podcast. I am the Fat Loss Pro, Chris DeFay, and today I have brought on with me Scott Stevenson, which I've only recently become mates with, as I read an article not that long ago, which I was super impressed with. And then when I finished it, I immediately found out who wrote it, and then I've emailed him. Because pretty much I just wanted to chat with him, connect, and then also I wanted to bring him on to the Fat Loss Pro podcast to share his insights and know-how for yourself. Being the creator of Fortitude Training, which he will touch on more later in the interview at the end, I really consumed this whole book in one sitting. I nailed it from start to finish, and I was really loving the way he put it together, but also the system behind it that he's created. So today we're solely concentrating more on fat loss, as I'm sure that we'll be able to bring him back on soon to talk hypertrophy and muscle building with his views and techniques on that. Now, I have another 5-star iTunes review today that is from Ebony, which, boy, this has made me smile. It reads, "Fitness information overload. I'm loving this podcast and the variety of guests interviewed. As a fitness model athlete, PT, and studying nutrition, I'm finding the information provided is of great quality and that I can utilize it with my own training and clients. Thank you for producing. Keep them coming." Thank you so much, Ebony, for taking this time out and giving me this feedback. I'm certainly going to keep making the effort to keep publishing this for you and the other listeners, as there are a wide range of people listening to this podcast, such as yourself, that are either competing physique athletes, personal trainers, health practitioners, and just the people wanting to get in great shape. I really try and vary and have as much information that's easy to use and to apply for yourself, and those who want it to use to become a better coach as well. Now, I would love for you listening to go to www.chrisdufay.com, where I have each of the interview show notes to quickly pick up on the links mentioned, plus all the information with the free fat loss diets and a lot more for yourself. And as Ebony has done as well, I'd love you to be able to leave an iTunes review, as much it is to give me the feedback and know-how that you're enjoying this and also getting a lot out of it. But also it helps spread the word of the Fat Loss Pro podcast. Now, let's get into this chat with myself and Scott as we cover some great topics that we've both been getting asked a lot on, and he's got some great insights for you. Scott, thank you very much for taking your time out and having a chin wag with me, mate, for the Fat Loss Pro podcast. I really appreciate this, and I think for the listener to know kind of how we've gotten connected was I was reading an article that was on John Meadows' site that you have written, which was fantastic, and it was on carbohydrates, which is a topic that we'll cover today. But I was really impressed with the article that you wrote, and as soon as I finished it, I got to the bottom. I was like, God damn, who wrote this? I've got to get in contact with this guy. And so therefore we've been having a bit of a chat, quite a bit of a chat recently, and obviously I've wanted to get you on here. So thanks very much, Scott.
Oh, you're very welcome. My pleasure, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
Beautiful. So what I want to touch on today is we're going to focus mainly on fat loss, and we're going to cover it mainly with 3 different concepts that we can go over. So the first is metabolic flexibility. And firstly, Scott, can you kind of describe what metabolic flexibility is for the listener?
Yeah, sure. The notion is basically, you can almost think of it as the opposite of what you see in metabolic syndrome, which is the cluster of diseases such as diabetes and obesity, cardiovascular disease or hyperlipidemia, et cetera, where someone does a very poor job, metabolically speaking, of managing food that comes in, and they end up storing fat preferentially and becoming obese, getting type 2 diabetes, hyperinsulinemia, hyperlipidemia, all those things which I hate to say it are starting to typify your American, your American citizen, or what a lot of people tend to think when they think of Americans, actually, with the overweight epidemic that we've got now. So that metabolic syndrome then was kind of the opposite of metabolic flexibility. The idea of flexibility is such that if you feed someone carbohydrates, they do a really good job of storing those carbohydrates as glycogen or oxidizing them as well and not gaining body fat. Or if you feed someone high-fat diet or high-fat meals, they oxidize the fat preferentially. And this is what you see, and people have known this for years, basically, that generally if you feed someone a high-fat meal, this makes sense, you end up oxidizing more fat. You can measure that with indirect calorimetry and the respiratory exchange ratio and all the kind of basic exercise physiology techniques that have been around for decades now. And if you feed someone a high carbohydrate meal, you'll see that they oxidize more carbohydrates. So the metabolically flexible person makes use of the fuel source very, very well. They can adapt to high fat or high carbs depending on what's incoming. And the metabolically inflexible person, which would be someone who's got that cluster of diseases associated with metabolic syndrome, is going to be someone who doesn't do a very good job of handling those incoming macronutrients.
Beautiful. So I think maybe before I ask the question, how do we become more efficient with metabolic flexibility, I think, and I want to cover and maybe make real sure of is, so during the course of a day, obviously we have our training period and our period that's completely away from training. So say if someone's training in the afternoon, they're probably, especially with maybe more of what you and I are aligned with, the start of the day will be more protein and fats. And then as they lead up into their training and after their training, it's going to be more protein and carbohydrates. So therefore they could be burning more lipids, more fat during the AM of the day. And then obviously they're focusing more on the muscle tissue around the training session.
Right. Yeah, that's, the idea of metabolic flexibility as it's starting to become known, I think, in the bodybuilding world, is that very kind of nutrient timing or throughout the day type timing of your meals, such that you have lower carb, higher fat meals in the morning, and then higher carbs at night. And that's what you typically would see, especially if you have someone who's doing a nutrient timing approach and they're eating around an afternoon workout. It might get noisy here. My dogs are...
No, it's absolutely fine. Do you think that... I know there's quite a few people who are poo-pooing the nutrient timing sort of methodology. Do you think there's a lot of truth behind it?
So that could be a big Yeah, a lot of people have been poo-pooing because they read Brad Schoenfeld and Alan Aragon's. They had an actual review study, and then they did a meta-analysis as well. And they generally found from the meta-analysis that there was really no, and this was just protein timing, so they didn't look at the combination of protein and carbohydrates, but they didn't have positive findings. But if you go through and read that study and actually read the discussion, they're well aware that they weren't studying people who were training anywhere at the level of most of the people who are competing, especially as bodybuilders, who are listening to this podcast. So a lot of times, just because, and everyone knows this pretty much, who's paid attention to research in these kinds of areas, is that it's more convenient to take people who are untrained and train them, and it's also very hard to get people who are already trained and get them to give up 3 or 4 months of their time to adjust their training, adjust their diet or what have you to a new program, especially when there's a possibility that they might end up being in the quote-unquote control group where you're not expecting anything positive to happen. So you can actually, the listeners out there who thought about this but haven't really considered it, think about what you might do if a researcher comes up to you, especially someone who's wearing a lab coat, who doesn't look like he's a big bodybuilder or what have you. Not all exercise physiologists are, and says, hey, what I'd like you to do, I wonder if you'd be able to volunteer for this study. We can't pay you anything, but you got to come into our lab and do our training program, not your training program, and you have to follow this diet that we're going to give you. And we're not going to be able to know, and we're not going to tell you either, but you might be assigned to the group that's not really supposed to make much changes because we're trying to test the idea that this other particular way of eating is going to be more advantageous. So what do you think? Would you give me 4 months of your time in training? And a lot of people don't want to do it. You know, they've got to know they're going to get something out of the gig.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to the topic at hand, that particular study is one of the main reasons why people are not so impressed with it. But there are some studies that are out there. Willoughby has a study, for instance, where they've taken the timing aspect and put carbohydrate protein combinations around the training compared with a group that gets the same amount of macronutrients at a time of the day away from training. So there's some studies that are out there, but one of the more practical hands-on things that really makes sense, and this is a tough one to study, is that the idea of nutrient timing around an activity is to make sure that you've got those nutrients provided at the time when you've got the most volatility in the muscle, when you've got the greatest muscle protein turnover, the muscle's trying to refuel glycogen. Mm-hmm. You've just created the stimulus for growth. So you want to basically provide the building blocks, the hormonal milieu, everything that's required at that time point. And guess what? A lot of bodybuilders are eating 6 times a day anyway.
Yeah.
They've already got those, they've basically satisfied those basic requirements of nutrient timing, so that if they add in a 400-calorie peri-workout recovery supplement of some sort, and they've eaten an hour beforehand, they're getting an hour afterwards, and their workout only lasts an hour, well, they still got nutrients coming in from those previous meals during the day, so you're not adding anything. You can't have a 2,000-calorie recovery supplement expected to do much more than a 1,000, except maybe make you fat. So I cover this actually on a 3-part article on Elite FTS. People can look me up over on that site where I'm a columnist. But that's one of the things, is that the timing is really going to, the effectiveness, at least, and this is my speculation, just based on basic physiology, is that the timing is going to be effective for people who, for instance, are training fasted and wake up in the morning and they're not eating anything. They're going in and they're training, and they're for instance doing an hour-and-a-half workout, and they start off by training chest, shoulders, and triceps, and they do cardio for half an hour.
Yeah.
So they may get up, train chest from 9 until 9:30, and then when they get done at their workout at 10:15, let's just say on a Saturday, they don't have to work. So, yeah. So that 10:15, they take in their post-workout shake, or maybe they go have a meal. Somehow it's maybe closer to 11. There's some gastric delay. Next thing you know, you train chest at 9 o'clock and you haven't got any nutrients going to that muscle for 2 hours.
Yeah.
Well, people would never do that. You wouldn't train and then just sit around and wait 2 hours. In fact, there's research showing that you can negate training adaptations by waiting 2 hours.
Yeah.
Altogether. So anyway, the timing issue is really a matter of physiology and making sure there's food that's there, to a large part, I think, especially with people who are covering all their bases already with big meals. They're in a caloric excess. And this is one of the things from Aragon and Schoenfeld's meta-analysis as well, is that they found that simply adding protein to the diet was, because they were able to analyze this through the course of the studies that they did the meta-analysis with, was the largest factor. There was a significant effect in terms of adding protein to the diet in terms of the muscle growth, muscle hypertrophy that was evoked over all the studies that they included in their analysis.
And I guess that's something we've known for quite some time.
Yeah. I mean, it is. People have kind of poo-pooed that, and it's hard to look at in the scientific world because of the limitations with the nitrogen balance technique and things of those natures. But there was another meta-analysis that showed the same thing, and Aragon and Schoenfeld, of course, knew that. So it does come down to a certain degree to making sure you've got all your bases covered, and if one of those bases is missing because you're not taking anything during the course of your workout, then inter or peri-workout recovery supplementation is probably a base that you want to put back into play.
Yeah, no, very good point. Very good point. All right, so going back to the metabolic flexibility, how does someone get better at metabolic flexibility?
So we've got, especially, I'll kind of address this from the standpoint of someone who's training, they're lifting weights, etc. Metabolic flexibility, if you think back to people with metabolic syndrome, is going to be characterized by someone who, for instance, has very good insulin sensitivity. Mm-hmm. So when they take in carbohydrate, they don't have to secrete a large amount of insulin. They don't become clinically hyperinsulinemic. They've got good glucose tolerance. So that carbohydrate is easily disposed of, and with a lesser amount of insulin. And the lesser amount of insulin, of course, is going to have effects on lipolysis. And it's going to mean you're going to have less chance of storing those carbohydrates as fat. On the other side of the coin, you also want to be able to make sure your body has somewhat adapted. And there are studies where they've done this. This is mainly with endurance training individuals, but there are studies that have been done where they try to adapt them to high-fat diets. The idea from the endurance training studies was if you can adapt to a high-fat diet and improve your ability to break down and utilize fats, your lipolytic ability, that this might have a glycogen sparing effect. People running marathons and that sort of thing, so they could avoid the bonk at the end of a long cycling. But this is the thing that really hasn't been tested as directly in the human literature for sure. But the notion is there, and it makes sense if you look at some of the peripheral physiology around the idea that if you take in, as you were noting earlier, lower carbohydrates during a period of time, that's going to increase your insulin sensitivity. And at that time, of course, you need to meet your caloric needs, so you want to take in fats, fats like omega-3 fatty acids, DHA and EPA, that are going to help with insulin sensitivity as well.
Yep.
And then when you have a workout, which in and of itself is going to increase your insulin sensitivity, you take in the carbohydrates at that time point. So basically, you've got a period of time where you're low carbohydrate, improving your insulin sensitivity, taking in healthy fats, potentially even helping with your cardiovascular risk profile, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you've got the situation around when you've trained and after when you've trained, when your glycogen levels are low, you've got the insulin-like effect of contraction. You've got this ideal scenario for disposing of carbohydrate. Then you take in your carbohydrate, and you've got a really good scenario whereby you're going to shuttle that carbohydrate into the skeletal muscle, into even the reduced hepatic stores in your liver. Because let's say you finished your previous carbohydrate the day before, and you didn't have any carbs all night long, and then you've gone most of the day without carbohydrates, your liver is going to be pretty close to empty, if not empty, as far as glucose at that point. So you also have some stores there in the liver. So we've got muscle sensitized, we've got the liver sensitized. You take in your carbohydrate, you're going to release less insulin, so you're going to have potentially less fat stored in the fat cells from the carbohydrates coming in. More in the muscle cells. You're basically redirecting the nutrients where you want them, and you're creating the hormonal milieu that you want, low insulin, for instance, to have better insulin sensitivity. So this kind of repeated pattern is what you're gonna try to evoke with timing of your carbohydrate around your training, as well as potentially, if you can, and this is what the idea of metabolic flexibility is coming out in some of the research, is that there's something about having that low carb period, at least in the morning, and the higher carb period later in the day. It's not entirely clear. There's superimposed upon all this that can kind of get complex here. You've also got a circadian rhythm too. So things can vary there. And I can't even really address that because I haven't seen that studied and anyone try to tease that out. But what is probably important, regardless of whether you're going high carb in the morning and then low carb later in the day and throughout the night, so your carbohydrate periods in the morning versus at the night, what probably is maybe most important is that you're having a somewhat longer period of lower carbohydrates to restore your insulin sensitivity.
That's perfect. I think this is perfect to segue. That I had my next question ready to fire along was obviously how do we use carbs to obviously become leaner and not be a cranky pants the whole time as well. But I think that's good. And so do you think it's more, rather than not going down the circadian rhythm path, but say if someone's training in the AM, therefore their carbohydrates would be in their AM around their training period, and then obviously their lower carb period is through the rest of the day in their PM. Would you agree with that?
I think so, without a doubt. They're just the training is so absolutely vital. I mean, that's really kind of that's where we're doing all the steering of the physiology. I mean, you're trying to build muscle. You're trying to basically direct your body composition with the training. We're not doing endurance cycling, for instance, trying to get to look like a bodybuilder.
Yeah.
So this is my opinion. At least you really need to support the training as much as you possibly can. So having the carbohydrates in there with the protein to amplify your insulin around the training. Of course, being as sensitive as you can at that time as well, but you want the insulin there because it's going to be anti-catabolic, potentially even anabolic when you've got amino acids and enhanced blood flow at the same time to the skeletal muscle. So, yeah, the very last thing, and this has been my experience in about 3 decades in the gym, trying to figure some of this stuff out, playing around with the Peri-workout recovery supplementation for close to 15 years now, I think. Is that the last thing that I ever drop out when I'm dropping fat or when I'm prepping for a show or when I'm working with the client and doing the same, I always keep those carbohydrates in there around the workout.
Yeah, no, completely agree. Because I think there's obviously there's the notion that insulin sensitivity is higher in the morning and then obviously drops off throughout the day, and therefore I guess that's why people obviously are so keen into their bloody egg whites and oats for the breakfast. But obviously if they're training in the PM, it's a complete reverse. They're not worrying about that. Yeah, well,
the thing is you'll get some insulin release from protein. So you've got the insulinogenic amino acids as well. But I really wonder, I would love to see this. I've dug and not been able to find direct answers. What happens do you still see a reduction in insulin sensitivity, glucose tolerance at 5 o'clock versus 8 o'clock in the morning if you've had 3 or 4 meals and they've all been low carbs, or does it continue to improve?
Yeah, good point. Great.
Yeah, so I don't know, but as far as you mentioned cranky pants, and that's super important, I think, too. A lot of people, sometimes it's just having some meals in before they train.
Yeah.
But some people feel better some people don't like to train with food in their stomach. And there can be a trade-off here. Some people don't want to. Some people they get nausea when they try to do an intra-workout recovery supplement, and that can be what they're taking in. That can be not getting used to it. There's actually been some endurance exercise research that's been done showing people there are some adaptations in the gastrointestinal system. This is totally what I found.
They're able to tolerate the intra-training nutrition better. Yep.
Yes. Yeah, you get better at it, and I worked my way up. If you look at those Elite FTS articles, it was probably around 1999 or so, and it was the Alternative Steroid Handbook that I picked up. I'm blanking on his name now. He's a professor in California, in one of the Cal State schools, who first proposed. He has some work out there where he was giving 2,000 calories during workouts, and he called this insulin loading was the idea, with no exogenous insulin, just endogenous insulin release from massive amounts of carbohydrate, and there's some protein as well. And the idea was that was going to create, this was before they'd really kind of teased out that a lot of what insulin does is anti-catabolic and not anabolic. But the idea was to try to create a really anabolic response by taking in massive amounts of food. And they had some gastric distress in their subjects, but they were able to do 2,000 calories during an hour and a half long workout. And I worked my way up to that. I was doing that. I was putting in these. I think American Bodybuilding makes these 1,000-calorie drinks, XXL Extreme, and then a couple packets of a Myoplex or a Lablata Lean Body, some whatever was available, and it was just a massive, goopy, concrete-like substance. But I was able to get those in and deal with them, and I had to figure out how much fiber to add and those sorts of things. And
how did you find the results?
From phenomenal. I mean, I was able to do things back training then that I didn't think I could get away with. I couldn't get away with before. So, and there were several things. One, a lot of that was when I was really trying to pile in some calories. So, one of the advantages with having an intra-workout recovery supplement like that can be that you can space your meals out, and basically you're kind of multitasking in terms of getting your calories in throughout the course of the day. A lot of people want to eat 6 or 7, even 8 meals a day because they can only handle so many calories at a given period of time.
Yep.
Well, if normally you wouldn't eat, for an hour or two before your workout, and then you work out, and then you eat as soon as you can afterwards. Well, there's maybe 3 or 4 hours that you haven't eaten anything. That's lost time during the day.
Yeah.
If you get adjusted to an intra-workout recovery supplement like this, you can actually put that in. And I found that I was able to eat afterwards more quickly. So it made it a lot easier to get calories in.
Do you also think the importance of the intra-training drink or nutrition or whatever you want to call it is obviously having the nutrients present in the blood as you're training?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, most people are training, unless you're doing maybe a CrossFit type workout or you're doing some sort of a circuit training type workout. Most standard bodybuilding training is sequential. So you train legs, and then you train calves, then you train biceps and traps or what have you. So post-workout for your legs is intra-workout for everything else. So and there is some timing. A guy by the name of research by the name of Tipton has demonstrated some of this, but yeah, I really think there is, because you're turning on the protein synthetic machinery after your first set.
Yep.
It's right there. And degradation goes up to a certain degree as well. So, why not try to, heck, if you're resting 3 or 4 minutes, let's say you're doing, pretty heavy loading type of training, and you're resting 2, 3, 4 minutes between sets. Why waste the time?
Yeah.
Why not have that in your system? And why not beat the gastric delay? Because after you get done working out, a lot of people aren't hungry. And you also, so a lot of your blood's going to be shunted away from your GI. So if you're taking in food, especially if it's regular whole meal food that needs to be digested, it's not like a hydrolyzed protein source or something like that. You're gonna have a gastric delay that's going to slow down the presentation of those nutrients even more so.
Perfect. So if someone's looking purely on a fat loss standpoint for their goal, what do you think their peri-workout nutrition should be?
We're on the same. I was about to bring that up because I wanted to bring this back to the topic. Yeah, that's perfect. The thing that's really cool about this is that many of these studies have been done with just like 6 grams of amino acids, essential amino acids, and like 35 grams of carbohydrate. Very, very small amounts, and they're showing positive effects on protein synthesis during the hours after training.
Wow. So
you don't need to take in, a 500 calorie shake or 1,000 calorie shake and then feel like you're starving the rest of the day. Essentially, the 6 grams of essential amino acids has been used in many studies as well. So it doesn't take a whole heck of a lot. The thing that I recommend to people in general is a lot of people just use the branched chain amino acids, and there's reasons for that. Some of the early studies were showing, and these studies are still valid, anti-catabolic effects on muscle soreness. And this is in some of the research or some of the articles I've written. If you go back and kind of tease through the studies, a lot of these were using the tracers. All of the essential amino acids, some of this is rodent research, some of it's human, but probably all of them, I think I've covered almost all of them in various studies, have their own beneficial anabolic effects. And it makes sense. They're essential because your body can't make them.
Yeah.
So I kind of think of this whole thing as it's like a construction scene here. So we've got a scenario where we're trying to replenish the broken down muscle tissue, and we've got ingredients that we have to have, the essential ones, and these are like maybe the specific 2x4s that have been lacquered the way that the house that you're constructing needs to look. So you got to use those. You have no choice in the matter. You can't just go and grab some generic 2x4 somewhere else and think it's going to fill the bill, because it's not. So whatever you do, waits on those. People want to just take leucine, and leucine, of course, will trigger a protein synthetic response. But what has been found actually is that giving the essential amino acids, this hasn't been broken down for leucine particularly, this very, 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 very beneficial effect, but is that at some point in time, you end up, the protein synthetic stimulation ends up stopping. Mm-hmm. You've got basically a refractory effect there. So all the essential amino acids have anabolic effects. Why not give them all? Why just use 3 of them or use 1 of them when you don't need to use a massive amount? It's not like you need to use 100 grams of essential amino acids to get the effect. 6 will do the deal. So use them all, but I also suggest including a whole protein source, because one of the things you can do to reverse this muscle full effect, it's sometimes called, or this kind of refractory effect, where the protein synthesis can't be restarted by giving essential amino acids again, is just to provide either some carbohydrate or provide some non-essential amino acids. Yep. And that basically is sending the signals like, hey, okay, we got everything we need. We've got the nails, we've got the staples, we've got the small boards, everything else that needs to go to the house, and of course we've got the special lacquered 2x4s that are essential amino acids.
So just as because you touched on the leucine before, do you recommend that they hit at least 3 grams of leucine to get that protein synthesis kickoff?
Yeah, you probably been talking to Lane, I'm guessing.
I did talk to him a couple of weeks ago, but there was something I've read. It was ages ago that I had the conversation with a good friend not that long ago about it again.
Yeah, no, and that's what you'll find in the studies, for instance, where they're showing about 20 grams of a whole protein source, like a whey, which is very high in leucine, very high in essential amino acids. That's about the content of that, which seems to max out protein synthesis. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, at least 3 grams.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it this way. Let's take a 200-pound competitor who's really trying to push the fat loss. Yep. They're really trying to get as lean as they can. So they might be taking in, let's say, 300 grams of protein during the day, and they've got let's say 5 meals and then an intra-workout. Mm-hmm. So this is 6 meals. So that's about 35 grams of protein per meal, roughly. That's going to be plenty. Why not, even if you've got your greatest risk of muscle loss when you're breaking down the muscle, when you're creating the muscle damage and turning on the muscle turnover during your workout, why skimp with like 3 or 4 grams of leucine during that period of time? That's when you're most vulnerable to muscle loss. Yeah. Why not do 50 grams of protein peri-workout? Because you're taking in 300 during the day. Yeah. Or why not put 100, before your workout, 100, 125 before your workout, and during that period of time when you can potentially replace some muscle that you may have lost during the course of your diet during the previous 12 or 18 hours, load your protein in the post-workout period when you've got muscle protein synthesis turned on and you've got increased breakdown as well.
Good point.
Yeah, so, yeah, it's funny. It's, sometimes people take those numbers of minimums and what have you, and you kind of look at that, and it's nice to have a specific number like that. It's like, give me the bottom line, man. Yeah. Come on, Scott, quit beating around the bush. Is it 3 grams, 5 grams, 10 grams? Yeah. How much does it need to be? And you can take studies like that, or take those minimums and say, okay, well, I'll use that. I'll use the bare minimum, but shit, why use 3 grams, especially in the context of what you're doing in a very practical sense, when you can maybe, and it's not overkill. It's not overkill to use 15 grams of leucine. I wouldn't do that. I'd go more with like 15 grams of an essential amino acid blend, which might have 3 grams of leucine. Yep. But yeah, so yeah, I think that's my thought there. Yeah, at least 3 grams will do the trick.
No, it's perfect. No, Scott, spot on, mate. You nailed it. Okay, so let's go on. Did the card. Let's go cardio, because I've been bombarded with a lot of questions recently, and obviously it's just always around. Cardio for fat loss. Give me your 101 on it.
Well, see, now you're going to get me rambling again, Chris.
That's what I got you on for, Scott.
I ramble a lot. Got to keep this guy on track, man. The purpose of cardio, of course, is to create a caloric deficit, spend more energy, And the potential advantage would be that you can take in more food. So if you can take in more food, you're going to have a more anabolic effect from food. But cardio in and of itself is not an ideal stimulus for people who are wanting to hold on to muscle mass. You can see that in training studies for the most part. Although if you take someone who's untrained, you can actually see muscle gains from doing just like jogging programs, that kind of stuff. But obviously we know that resistance training is a far superior stimulus for holding on to muscle mass. So my general take, and everyone is different on this, of course, but my general take is do as little cardio as you possibly can. And that's going to vary depending on where a person starts in terms of their body fat. If someone is, let's say someone's 300 pounds and they're 30% body fat. People who are larger like that, they'll hold on to fat-free mass really, really well. I mean, they don't lose hardly anything. I mean, in most of the studies that show when they're dropping fat. Of course, some people who are that large are not going to drop fat very well because they're genetically predisposed to have lots of body fat. So that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone can get away with no cardio. But in many cases, folks like that, especially because just the increased activity if someone's not very active, they can do cardio and not have a problem. If someone's starting a diet, and my preference is in general that if someone plans on doing cardio because cardio has been advantageous for them in the past, sorry, my dogs are playing in the background, the noises, that they would have started doing some before they start their diet. So that's their body's already adjusted to that stimulus, which is really to a certain degree it's inherently catabolic. And we can go into why that is probably the case. At least in terms of the way most people do kind of endurance cardio. Cardio is inherently catabolic, but if someone has been making gains and they've been doing cardio, for instance, for health reasons, that in their off season, that's a great time to have it. So now what they've done is they allow themselves to increase their food intake. And they're offsetting this to a certain degree with the cardio, and that's a great advantage to have when they're dieting down. So as unusual as it may seem, an answer for cardio in terms of dieting is to start doing your cardio before you start dieting, so to speak. Have that there beforehand so that you don't try to start dieting and then add in the catabolic stress of the cardio.
No, I think that's a good point. I also think how you started that off as well is obviously you start with the minimum amount as possible, and I also think it's important to say for the listeners, slowly titrate that up as well. So add little bits at a time. You don't suddenly go from, all right, I'm not doing anything to, okay, I'm doing 60 minutes a day, or do you know what I mean? You don't make those big leaps because they're not needed. Yeah,
I agree with that, wholeheartedly. It does depend on the person as well. There are some people, especially if they're, because most cardio is really kind of lower body dominant. There are some people that, cardio just eats away their legs. And if they try to jump right into that, they'll lose leg size, leg muscle mass really, really quickly. There are other people, Jose Raymond is one person, for instance, he's done diets, I think, with very little cardio in the past, at least according to what I see online. And he's done diets where he's doing 2 hours of cardio, and the guy's got phenomenal legs. Loses nothing. So, and of course he's starting off where he's able to squat 500 pounds for 12, 15 reps peak. So, and he's maintaining that as he goes along as well. So he's countering the anti-hypertrophic stimulus, the catabolic stimulus of the cardio with some pretty impressive weight training, pretty impressive loading as well.
And do you think that's where obviously you get the best results from the cardios because you're offsetting it with the proper resistance training?
Well, I think it's better to have a scenario where you've increased your caloric intake in the off season so that you can create the deficit needed, so you don't have to do any cardio. So you don't have to have that. But that's the catch-22 is that the cardio will then cut into your ability to train hard, just because it's psychologically and physiologically fatiguing, but it also reduces the muscle mass, so you can't maintain that stimulus.
I think that's a good point. So I just want to jump in because you just got my mind ticking over. Was obviously, I think an important point that a lot of people need to do is that off season per se, even if someone's not competing, but that off season where maybe someone has to then not be so determined on trying to cut fat as hard as possible. But obviously by doing that off season the right way, you're obviously able to lean up much easier and faster.
Yeah. I mean, I think an off season could be very different for different people.
Yeah.
I mean, some people learn the lesson. It may take them, 5 or 6 years if they're doing an off season and a contest dieting period where they get big and then they just suffer, and they end up gaining a pound or two, and it really doesn't help them out because they have to diet so hard they lose their muscle mass.
For someone that's not competing, say you've got a fitness bunny, someone's serious about being in good shape, but they're not going to compete. How would you recommend what their off season should be, or how they should get to their off season and then sort of cycle back around?
As far as cardio goes?
Yes.
Well, first I'd want to ask them, that person, how do they really like cardio? Do they dig it? Do they enjoy it? Because some people do. I mean, years ago, there were periods of time when I was running a lot. I liked running. It was enjoyable. Of course, I wouldn't like it now because my knees wouldn't last about 20 steps. But and I enjoyed it. So if they really like it and they enjoy that, I would try to find the mode that they really dig. Do they want to be on like a rat in a wheel in a gym on a treadmill when it's beautiful outside? Do they like going after it with cardio? High intensity interval training is a phenomenal way.
Yeah.
For many people to help keep body fat low. So if they like the cardio, I'd suggest them do the kind that they like because so they can maintain that. So it's enjoyable. I mean, cardio is, for a lot of people, it just ends up being like this period of like, okay, now I got to suffer because I know I need to do this. I don't really want to, but here we go. This is just so I'll look the way I want to look, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're not someone who's trying to win shows or reach the pinnacle of of their physique's capabilities, then do it, make it fun, have a good time with it.
Yeah, great point.
But if they don't like cardio and they like training with weights, and this was one thing that I thought we could even get into. I mean, you can really expend a tremendous amount of calories if you go after it with big compound movements, push them safely, of course, close to failure, and really just train your guts out in the gym. You can create a post-exercise oxygen consumption that's on the order of hundreds of calories, if not more, over the next day.
Yeah, it's a good point. Let's go into that. Go into the epoch, and obviously using that same scenario in which you just touched upon.
Well, you take somebody, for instance, who might go and do, let's say, they weight train 5 times a week. They do one or two body parts a day. They're training once weekly, and then they do cardio, 5 or 6 days for half an hour. But they don't really like the cardio, and they really like training with weights, and they like going after it with deadlifts, squats, compound stuff, those sorts of things. You can as long as you set up a program. We talked a bit about my book. I don't want to make this a plug about the book, but you can set up a program where you're varying the stimuli, trying to make sure that you don't overtrain yourself, and do on a regular basis 3 or 4 times a week compound movements like train your legs 3 times a week, doing squats, leg presses, lunges, things of that nature, high reps, heavier stuff, cluster type sets, various different stimuli, so that you've got some good variety. You're training really, really hard because you're training with high frequency, so you're going to train your full body. So you're getting good long workouts. It's not like you're doing 20-minute workouts and you're like, I wish I could do more. You're in the gym for a good period of time, so you're training much of your body many times a week. And that kind of training, when you're going and doing squats and bent over rows and pull downs and maybe overhead presses and incline press, something like that, all in one workout. For sets that are close to failure or to failure at least once in the course of a set or a series of sets, you can create a massive epoch. with that type of training. And if you structure it right, you can get away with training on a regular basis. And this is why I think I'd love to see someone do the study. I haven't seen it. It's been a while since I looked, but stuff like CrossFit, despite all of its detractions, that training is gut wrenching.
Yeah,
and those guys are doing big full body movements a lot of cases.
Yeah.
But some of the things don't really look like a movement per se. They look like someone trying to hurt themselves, but depends on who it is, of course, and where it's being done. But nonetheless, the effort is phenomenal, and that becomes a cardiovascular nature. With the training system that I use, I'm not trying to evoke a cardiovascular adaptation at all, but I've taken my heart rate between sets when I'm doing some of what are the heavier sets, and I'm up to my predicted heart rate max. So I'm breathing like a locomotive.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because actually it was only a couple of days ago I was doing legs, and I was halfway through it. I was gassed. I was heaving like. It wasn't a pretty sight, not at all, but it was exactly what you're talking about.
You can, I mean, if you go and try to do 20 sets of legs where you're training legs, like that for an hour or so, you can't obviously come back and do that 2 days later.
True.
But if you train legs with that sort of intensity and did like 3 sets, and then you went after it, let's say with some bent over rows or another upper body compound movement, a big one, and you train your entire body in that sense, you could come back and do a workout very similar to that, structured differently, a few days later. And the thing that people, a lot of people, I don't know how many times I've heard this over the course of the years, they'll train legs where they're doing that, heavy compound type stuff, lots of muscle mass engaged. They can't sleep that night. They're lying there and their heart's just going like crazy. And that's residual effects of epinephrine, which is one of the things that's thought to contribute to the post-exercise oxygen consumption.
Yep.
And this can last over 24 hours, but you gotta go after it. The article that someone actually just asked me about this article I wrote, they couldn't find it. But there's a study that was done. It's like over 10 years old now. I think Schenke is the first name, and they had their subjects do, I think, 4 rounds of bench press, squat, and a clean. To failure or close to failure, safely. It took them about 30 minutes to do the workout, and they had a post-exercise oxygen consumption that was nearly 1,000 calories, I think, over the next 36 hours, and it was still elevated 36 hours after the workout.
Wow,
that's phenomenal. I mean, that's 1,000 calories is over an hour of cardio.
Yeah. I think it's a good point, because a lot of people touch upon what EPOC is and the benefits of EPOC, but I think the important thing as well is a lot of people just aren't training hard enough. They're going too soft with their training sessions to actually evoke that type of response.
I hate to sound like the old hardcore curmudgeon type of guy, but it's very. I train at several gyms here. I live in Tampa now, and I can't remember. There was a guy actually today. He was training pretty hard, but I don't see anybody training where you look like if you went up that like they might throw up on you, that type of thing. You just don't see that, and you don't. Some of it's because I think you have to find some inherent value in that. You have to have. I always tell people you got to have some loose screws in your head.
Yeah.
And that's the really. I mean, I don't want to make this totally about CrossFit, but that's one of the cool things about CrossFit is they've got a community of people that support really high efforts like that.
Yeah.
And they applaud it.
Yeah.
I mean, they've been criticized because of injury risk and the kind of supporting the idea of giving yourself rhabdomyolysis or what have you, but you don't see that in your regular gyms. You don't see it in your big box gyms. In fact, the impression that's given, and of course this is very American centric here, but the impression that's given is that we're going to get you results and it's going to be really kind of pretty painless. There's going to be not a whole lot of effort that you have to put forth. In fact, we'll give you Tootsie Rolls on the way in and pizza on Friday nights and all these sorts of things. And as opposed to hey, look, we're going to build you up slowly, but we can make you into an absolute badass if you really want it.
Yeah.
So let's go have some fun and kick some butt and make this a good time, which is what they do in CrossFit, but you don't see that with weight training in the gym.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is unfortunate because you just, like, as far as EPOC goes, we go back to the research. I mean, they look at it after cardiovascular exercise, and like you have to go for it, like lactate threshold, which is about as fast as you can go for like an hour to get anything substantial, like maybe 50 calories in terms of cardio. And they've done circuit training as well, and this is mostly with untrained people, sometimes older folks, and they're training the whole body. But you're using machines, you're using like, a selectorized bicep curl or a knee extension or a hamstring curl. And you can do those all day long. You can train really hard that way, but that's a far cry from getting under a squat bar or picking up a deadlift.
Yeah, absolutely. The stimulus is completely different.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't want to go on a rant about the fitness industry, but yeah, in order to enjoy those things, you just enjoy the benefits of those things. You have to enjoy them as well, to some degree, in some sadistic way. It needs to be fun for you, like you're saying today. You're retching in the gym, basically.
Yeah.
And laughing about it, and if you're looking, like we're having the conversation before we started recording here. I was telling you, please torture yourself, basically. And you're like, you can't go do it.
Yeah.
So that when
it's not going to be a pretty sight in the gym later this afternoon. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah. Well, aside from a lot of these details, this is an overarching thing I've kind of told people, but, a lot of this is really, it doesn't have to be rocket science. You don't have to know about glucose transporters and metabolic flexibility and insulin sensitivity and some of these other things. If you can go in the gym and, figure out well enough and make it something that you can maintain, or that you make yourself one of the most impressive performance specimens in the gym. Like you're the guy who can pick up twice his body weight for reps and squat twice his body weight for reps, and you're making everyone look like they're in the slow lane in various ways. Be that doing cardio or what have you, you're gonna get fit for the most part. The changes are gonna happen. The body's gonna adapt.
I think it's a really good point, because it's really funny that when I came here to Bali, and then obviously I started training in the gym that I train at is somewhat hardcore. It's a sweat box, but the thing I was really impressed by, the couple of the local Balinese trainers, especially one, I went up to him after a couple of days and I go, I know, you know what, mate, I want you to train me. I'm going to pay you and you're just going to put me through a session. And the beauty in which I really sat back and watched how these guys worked was, they're not the most switched on dudes. They don't have the best education. They're not reading up on the studies. It's nothing about that. They do the bare basics, and they follow through with the basics all the way, but they absolutely pump themselves in the gym. They know how to grind and they know how to work. And you know what? They look phenomenal as well. Mm-hmm. And it's just that you can't, you can have the best program in the world, but the thing is, if you don't get down and get gritty with it, it ain't going to work. Yeah.
Chris, I had helped out with an interview with Dusty Hanshaw a few nights ago, and this didn't come up per se, but of course Dusty's known as someone who trains really hard, and I've heard Chris Aceto say this. I wanted to ask Dusty this question, if Chris ever really guided his training, because I've heard Chris say something that really, really struck me. This was several years ago, but he really doesn't. He likes to take on people who he knows trains hard, and they train all sorts of different ways. They do dog crap training, they do high volume training, do what have you, and he doesn't even really. He knows that they train their butts off, and he pays attention to what their body manifests. He knows that they got their pedal to the metal as far as the training goes, whatever style they happen to be doing. And he just adjusts based on what he sees dietarily, et cetera. And I think he may adjust cardio as well. But he doesn't even worry about any of the training parameters per se, because he knows they're training hard. And you're right. I mean, you could just go do deadlifts and standing overhead presses and and push-ups with boulders on your back, and you could turn into an impressive specimen. I've seen this happen too. Not knowing any idea, and not having any idea what you're doing, and when people make the comments like, well, Arnold didn't have peri-workout recovery supplementation, and Ronnie Coleman just he went to Outback Steakhouse or what have you afterwards. Well, Ronnie Coleman trained about as hard as any human being ever has. Yeah, exactly. And I think Arnold went after it as well. Yeah. And a lot of those old guys did that because they just absolutely loved it. So, and of course, Ronnie was eating massive amounts of food, and he was from Planet Ronnie. But there's a ton of truth to that. Just getting after it, and literally, the bottom line I think that I was getting at is that if you can get yourself to someone who has impressive lifts and impressive cardiovascular capacity at the same time, especially, which is kind of what CrossFit does, or just impressive lifts, you're going to be a big guy. The guy who can bench press 400 pounds is probably going to have some pretty impressive chest, shoulders, and triceps. Yeah. And the person who can go out and run, a 400-yard dash in like a minute or so is gonna probably be pretty lean. Yeah. And look pretty impressive. Yeah. So.
No, great point. Great point. All right, mate. So last one that I want to throw your way before we kind of start wrapping this up is, can everyone stay lean? Let's use the word shredded if they're disciplined enough the whole time.
Oh yeah. So this is a tough question because there's this nasty word. They should find another way to spell it with 4 letters because it's got too many when you spell it as genetics. And this actually came up, which kind of got me thinking about this topic. Came up on a thread on a discussion board that I go to every once in a while. I don't know that everyone can. I think that people can diet down and be very, very, very lean. But the extent of the quote unquote discipline and whether you're just actually kind of torturing yourself is going to vary tremendously when you look at across individuals.
That's a good point. Do you think someone can kind of like reset their body fat set point by, say, sitting at a certain like leanness? Do you know what I mean? They can kind of like reset where their body wants to go to.
You know what I have seen? That's a very good question. What I have seen is that as competitors become larger and they gain more muscle over the course of time, it becomes much easier to diet down. Yeah. You look at the relationship between fat-free mass and caloric expenditure, resting metabolic, what have you. And the more muscle mass, does suggest that you're going to have a higher caloric need, but it's not so much your rest per se. It's just the fact that you're carrying around that extra weight and you can do things with that extra weight. Resting muscle is not extraordinarily energy intensive in terms of caloric needs at rest.
Good point. And so, okay, I think that question was good, is like, how lean can someone stay year round? Because I think a lot of people have a skewed sort of view of how in shape they can be or should be able to be, because they might be, and I know a lot of people that say, especially with social media and stuff like that, they might get in shape, they take 101 photos of themselves and then slowly drip feed it out, and it kind of gives the perception of obviously they're veiny across their abdominals year round, where that's just not the case.
Yeah, I'm thinking of 2 people that I know fairly well. One person I went to graduate school with. We were training partners for a little while, and we did a number we had a lab where we basically used every body composition estimation technique available to get body fat. And I actually did that. We did the lab 2 weeks after my very first show. And I came in about 4 or 5% on all the methods, and he came in about a 5 or 6% on all the methods. Mm-hmm. He didn't diet for a show. He's never done a show. He doesn't diet at all. In fact, he doesn't pay attention to his diet. Never really did, except periods when we tried to gain weight. He's a genetic freak. He's 6% body fat, whether he's eating Doritos or he's trying. I don't think he's ever tried to lose body fat because he never has had a need to. Yeah. He also is 5'8", and he set the state record, I believe, for the high jump in the state of Georgia when he was in high school. So he's this guy, you know, I knew him. I literally saw him on a daily basis because he was a neighbor as well as we worked in the same lab for over 3 years. Always 6%. And that's documented with, you know, underwater weighing and bod pod, you know, the whole kit and caboodle, DEXA included. I got another client who, this guy wasn't a client, but I've got a client who has genetics. I'm not going to tell too much about him because, you know, client privilege, but yeah, he has the genetics just to be a really big guy. He's not especially tall, but it's interesting because he's been able to do fortitude training, my training system at the highest level with the highest volume tier and handle it like a champ. So he's got this tremendous workload. You could just, he's like he's made out of iron. You could beat him all day with a hammer and he wouldn't even notice in terms of training capacity. But dropping body fat is almost, it's impossible. And he's had a horrible time after shows trying to keep his body fat low. And you see this when you look, of course, just go out to your mall or, you know, go out in public, you know, especially a place like America where you have more of a melting pot in terms of genetic diversity. And you'll see this. And you'll see it actually, there's a really nice pair of studies that were done up in Canada that I bring up continuously because they're really, really cool. They basically sequestered twins for about 90 days, about 3 months. In one study, they dieted them. They developed a baseline, and they dropped their caloric intake by 500 calories a day, had them do 500 calories of endurance exercise. The other study, they had them overeat by 1,000 calories a day. So one study is a 1,000-calorie deficit at the beginning of the study. The other study is a 1,000-calorie excess at the beginning of the study. And they let them go like that for 3 months. Tremendous. There's like a threefold range in terms of the increases in body fat and body weight, or decreases, depending on whether they're in the excess or deficiency studies. So you would think if everyone's metabolism adjusted the same way, that everyone pretty much would be clustered together. You know, you'd have some experimental error because of how much they ate, or, you know, serving sizes weren't being exact or what have you, all over the place. You saw this range, and when you looked at the fraternal twins, the numbers were pretty close. Fraternal twins are genetically like brother and sister, pretty close and much more narrowly together than the range across twin pairs. When you looked at the identical twins, same DNA, dead on, within, you know, 10% or so in both studies.
And I think it's just interesting because so many times when I've had a conversation with someone just like yourself when we cover these topics, it always really comes down to, especially for the listener, is, well, you know what, that's the importance of having a good coach on your side, because it needs to be specified to yourself, because a cookie cutter situation ain't going to cut the mustard.
No. And you know, the thing is, one of the big issues with social media and just the way, the bodybuilding magazines, the fitness magazines, they're not going to put pictures of people in there when they're looking at their off-season worst. So our perception gets totally colored.
Very good
and
point.
People start thinking they should. I mean, that should is definitely a four-letter word. What should I look like? What should I do? And it's, you know, totally up to you, and to a certain extent, it's up to your genetics. That's what makes sense.
Perfect. All right, Scott, you've been absolutely tremendous this morning or tonight for you. So I just want to, before I let you go, I just really want to make sure that the listener can get a hold of you, find out where they can find out more about yourself. And also, I really do want you to be able to give your link, and I want to plug Fortitude Training because I'm a big fan. Easy enough. They can go to fortitudetraining.net, and that's a perfect link, you know, to put on your site for the book, and that takes them to my discussion board. So there's if you buy the book, you get a free subscription, and I ramble as much in my answers on the board as I did tonight in the interview. So it's pure brilliance. I'm a big fan. Don't be humble.
Yeah, well, you know, I get going, and when I finally have somebody who wants to listen to me go on and on, I think I just get a little overzealous and tend to have a little bit of verbal diarrhea. But
no, it's good. We could talk for days.
Yeah, well, that'd be good. You'd be good.
Okay, well, I know we're going to do another one together, mate. We'll focus on hypertrophy, but I tell you what, thank you so much for your time, mate. You've been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, you're welcome, Chris. My pleasure as well.
This has been another jaw-dropping podcast from the Fat Loss Pro, Chris DeFay. After subscribing to the Fat Loss Pro podcast,
Go to www.chrisdefay.com
to get your free fat loss diet.